Eleanor Hartley stood beside a marble pillar, her dance cart dangling from her gloved wrist like a noose fashioned from ivory and ribbon, empty, every line blank as fresh snow, marred by the promise of partnership or even momentary companionship. She had learned, over 6 excruciating seasons, to position herself in the architectural shadows, close enough to appear engaged with the festivities, distant enough that her isolation might seem a choice rather than a sentence. Her gown was ivory, muslin, and honest, mended at the hem where she had caught it on a garden gate 3 summers prior, while the debutantes swirled past in their waterfowl silks and Brussels lace. Eleanor wore the dignity of modest means like armor that no longer quite fit. At 24, she had aged beyond the dewy appeal that society demanded of its marriageable daughters. Her dowry was negligible. Her family name carried no weight beyond her father's quiet reputation as a country physician with steady hands and a generous heart. "Still here, I see," murmured Lady Ashford, sweeping past with a smile that did not reach her calculating eyes. How persistent. Eleanor's fingers tightened on her dance card, but her expression remained serene. She had perfected this particular mask, the one that suggested she found the wall positively fascinating, that she preferred observation to participation, that her heart did not fracture a little more with each pitying glance or deliberate avoidance. Across the ballroom, a ripple of excitement disturbed the carefully maintained composure of the assembled guests. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Fans fluttered with increased urgency. Even the string quartet seemed to swell with renewed purpose as the crowd parted like water before the prow of a ship. He entered as men of profound power often do without announcement, yet commanding absolute attention. Alexander Ravenswood, Duke of Ashford, had returned from 3 years abroad, and London had not forgotten him. 32 years of aristocratic breeding had carved him into something between a Renaissance sculpture and a Gothic cathedral. Sharp lines and restrained intensity. His evening clothes were flawlessly tailored, black as a moonless night, making his steel-gray eyes seem to burn with their own cold fire. Dark hair swept back from a face that suggested both cruelty and discipline, as though he had learned to harness some dangerous thing within himself, and now wore the effort like a second skin. On his arm, draped like a living jewel, was Lady Genevieve Moreau. The widow was a vision of calculated sensuality, crimson silk that clung to her curves with scandalous precision, rubies at her throat that caught the light with each deliberately graceful movement. She smiled at the assembled masses with the confidence of a woman who knew herself desired, her fingers possessive on the Duke's sleeve. Eleanor watched them as one might observe distant lightning, beautiful, dangerous, entirely separate from her small existence. She had no illusions about men like the Duke. They moved through the world collecting admirers the way other men collected hunting trophies, and women like her, plain, poor, practically invisible, did not even register on their peripheral vision. Yet, even as she thought this, his gaze swept the ballroom with evident disinterest, passing over eager debutantes and ambitious mothers with the dismissive efficiency of a man surveying property he already owned. And then, inexplicably, impossibly, his eyes found hers. The moment stretched, suspended in amber. Eleanor felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, pressing against her carefully constructed invisibility. His expression shifted just slightly, a hairline fracture in Marblein to something she could not name. Recognition, perhaps, though they had never met, or curiosity, though she could not imagine what about her might warrant it. Lady Genevieve noticed. Her scarlet smile froze into something brittle and sharp. Then the Duke moved, not toward the dancing couples, or the refreshment tables, or the cluster of eager young ladies, positioned like chess pieces by their calculating mothers. He walked directly across that glittering expanse of polished floor, his stride measured and deliberate, every eye in the ballroom tracking his progress with a rapt attention usually reserved for public executions or marriage proposals. He stopped before Eleanor, The pillar that had hidden her now framed her like a portrait she had not consented to sit for. Miss Hartley. His voice was low, cultured, edged with something she could not identify. Would you honor me with this waltz? The ballroom held its collective breath. 300 gossips suspended their whispers. Even the violins seemed to pause mid-note. Eleanor stared at his extended hand, gloved in pristine white, steady as stone, and felt the earth shift beneath her feet. This was not kindness. Dukes did not offer kindness to overlooked spinsters. This was something else entirely. A gauntlet thrown, a scandal initiated, a match struck in a room full of powder kegs. Her hand trembled as she placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers with unexpected warmth, and suddenly they were moving onto the dance floor, into the music that had begun again with almost frantic energy. She could feel the weight of every stare, hear the whispers beginning to build like storm clouds on the summer horizon. For 3 minutes, Eleanor Hartley waltzed with the Duke, while London watched and wondered and began, with vicious efficiency, to sharpen their knives. When the music ended, he bowed deeply, formally, and leaned close enough that his breath stirred the hair at her temple. What he whispered made her cheeks flame and her heart staggered in her chest. Then he released her and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of that glittering battlefield. No longer invisible, but terribly, dangerously seen. Eleanor woke to chaos, wearing the disguise of morning light. The household had erupted into a frenzy of whispers and hurried footsteps. And when she descended the narrow staircase of their modest townhouse, she understood why. The entrance hall had been transformed into a conservatory. White roses spilled from crystal vases like frozen waterfalls. Forget-me-nots clustered in delicate blue clouds, and red camellias burned among them like scattered coals. The fragrance was overwhelming, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. Her mother stood pale and trembling beside the arrangement, clutching a card as though it might explode. Eleanor, what have you done? The note was brief, written in a hand both elegant and deliberate. You dance as though you've forgotten the world is watching. Never forget again. Within hours, the calling cards stopped arriving. Invitations that had been extended lukewarm and obligatory, though they were quietly withdrawn. Mrs. Pemberton, who had tolerated Eleanor's presence at her Thursday salons for years, sent a terse message citing unexpected family obligations. Even the vicar's wife, normally impervious to scandal, crossed the street rather than acknowledge Eleanor during her morning walk. London society had rendered its verdict with characteristic swiftness. The Duke was toying with her. She was either fool enough to believe his attentions genuine or ambitious enough to grasp above her station. Either interpretation warranted exile. Eleanor bore the ostracism with outward composure, though each withdrawn friendship felt like a small death. She had never been beloved, but she had been tolerated, and now even that modest acceptance had been revoked. Her father, bewildered and concerned, suggested they might return to the countryside. Her mother wept quietly into her handkerchief, mourning the final death of matrimonial hopes she had long since abandoned. Then the gifts began to arrive with relentless regularity. On the third day, a book, Byron's collected works, bound in Moroccan leather, scandalously romantic and utterly inappropriate. The inscription read simply, "For a woman who has forgotten how to dream." On the fifth day, a carriage appeared at their door, the driver bearing a message that Miss Hartley's presence was requested at the Royal Botanic Gardens. Eleanor went, propriety be damned, and found the Duke examining a rare orchid with the focused intensity of a scholar. He had not summoned her for seduction, but for conversation. They spoke of botany and poetry, of travel and disappointment, of all the small beauties the world offered to those patient enough to observe. When he handed her a cutting from the orchid, carefully wrapped, his fingers brushed hers with deliberate gentleness. "Silence," he said, his gray eyes steady on hers. "This is the most undervalued of virtues." On the seventh day, she attended the opera and found herself directed to a private box. The Duke arrived moments later, ignoring the scandalized stares from surrounding seats. He did not touch her, did not even sit particularly close. Cool, but his presence beside her felt like a declaration of war against every whispered condemnation. Lady Genevieve Moreau, positioned strategically in the box opposite, watched with eyes like cut glass. The confrontation came at the Havisham garden party, beneath lanterns strung like captive moons among the trees. Eleanor had not wanted to attend, but her mother had insisted to hide was to admit defeat. She wandered to shadowed paths alone until she found him waiting beside a fountain, moonlight turning his features into something carved from silver and shadow. "Your Grace," her voice was steadier than her heartbeat. "I am not a toy for your amusement. This is sport. Release me now before I am utterly destroyed." He moved closer, his movements controlled yet charged with barely restrained intensity. "Miss Hartley, I have spent 3 years among the ruins of Rome, the salons of Paris, the courts of Vienna. I have been courted by princesses and propositioned by duchesses." His voice dropped lower, intimate as a confession. "And yet, I have never met a woman who wears her dignity like armor while her eyes betrayed the softness beneath. You are not my sport. You are my reckoning." Before she could respond, Lady Genevieve materialized from the darkness like a vengeful spirit in emerald silk. "How touching," she purred, her smile razor sharp. "The Duke has always had such a charitable heart. Poor dear Eleanor Shea cannot help that you pity her obscurity." The words were calculated to wound, to reduce, to remind Eleanor of every humiliation she had ever endured. Something inside her, some final restraints, napped cleanly. "Lady Moreau," Eleanor said, quietly, meeting those hostile eyes without flinching. "I would rather be pitied for my obscurity than infamous for my availability." The silence that followed was profound. Several nearby guests froze mid-conversation. Even the fountain seemed to cease its burbling. Lady Genevieve's face drained of color, then flooded crimson with rage. The Duke's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, but suggested profound satisfaction. Lady Genevieve turned and swept away, her exit marked by the violent rustle of silk and the snapping of her fan. That night, as rain hammered London's cobblestones into submission, Eleanor heard the commotion downstairs, her father's startled voice, the servants' gasps. She descended to find the Duke standing in their modest entrance hall, soaked through, his usually impeccable appearance undone by weather and urgency. Water dripped from his dark hair onto their worn carpet. His carriage waited in the street, a dark silhouette against the storm. "Kay," he addressed her father with formal precision despite his disheveled state. "Sir, I come to request permission to court your daughter, not as a duke seeking advantage, but as a man who has finally found something worth kneeling for." Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs, and his eyes found hers through the dim lamplight. In his gaze, she saw something she had never dared hope for. Recognition, not of what she lacked, but of everything she was. Her father's hand trembled on the doorframe, and the entire household held its breath, waiting. The Duke's library existed outside ordinary time, a sanctuary of leather-bound wisdom and firelight that seemed to belong more to dreams than London's rain-soaked reality. Eleanor had agreed to meet him there at midnight, 3 days after her father had given his cautious blessing. One final conversation, she had insisted, before she surrendered her answer to a question that would reshape her entire existence. Alexander stood by the window, his silhouette dark against glass that wept with rain. When he turned, she saw what polished society never witnessed: the fractures in his composure, the tremor in hands that poured brandy with uncharacteristic clumsiness. "I must tell you something," he said, his voice stripped of its usual aristocratic certainty. "A truth I have carried for 15 years. Eleanor waited, her heart a wild thing beating against her ribs. "I knew your father once, during the Crimean campaign, when I was 18 and foolish enough to believe war was glory rather than carnage. I contracted fever in a field hospital, the kind that turns men into corpses within days. The physicians had abandoned me to focus on soldiers they deemed salvageable. He paused, staring into his glass as though it held the past. Your father stayed 3 nights while I burned and raved. He did not know I was titled, did not care. He saved my life when others had written the eulogy. Eleanor's breath caught. A modest, quiet father had never spoken of the war, had carefully locked those memories behind a door he refused to open. So this is obligation. The words emerged, sharper than she intended. Repayment of an ancient debt. The brandy glass struck the table with enough force to echo. Obligation brought me to you, he said, closing the distance between them with a sudden intensity. Okay, but when you looked at me in that ballroom, not with awe or calculation, but with the exhaustion of someone tired of being unseen, I felt something I thought war had burned out of me. I felt known. His control was crumbling, each word a brick removed from the wall he had spent years constructing. Do you understand what it means to be desired for everything except who you are? Lady Genevieve wanted the Duke. Society wants the fortune and the title. But you, Eleanor, you asked for nothing. You demanded I justify my intentions, questioned my motives, challenged me to prove I was more than privilege wrapped in expensive cloth. And what if I'm not enough? Eleanor's voice broke on the question that had haunted her every sleepless hour. What if I embarrass you? What if London never forgives this transgression? He reached for her hand, his touch tentative despite his earlier boldness. Then let London burn. I have conquered ballrooms and boardrooms. I have bent the world to my will through sheer force of birthright and determination. But I cannot conquer the loneliness of being understood by no one. His gray eyes held hers with devastating honesty. You are not a compromise, Eleanor. You are the victory I did not know I was fighting for. The Queen's annual gala arrived with the weight of destiny. Eleanor stood before her mirror, transformed by emerald silk that caught the light like water, by diamonds at her throat that had belonged to duchesses for 7 generations. The Duke had sent them with a note. These have waited 2 centuries for a woman worthy of their fire. The ballroom was a cathedral of judgment, every eye tracking her entrance with predatory attention. Whispers followed her like trained dogs, some scandalized, some curious, all waiting to witness either her elevation or her destruction. Lady Genevieve positioned herself strategically, a vision in black silk that suggested mourning or threat. As Eleanor passed, she raised her voice with theatrical precision. How remarkable that the Duke's charity extends to such unexpected recipients. One can only admire his democratic spirit, elevating the overlooked to satisfy some peculiar whim. The words were designed to evoke pity, to reduce Eleanor's presence to an act of noble condescension. Around them, guests paused to observe the confrontation, their fans stilling like birds, sensing a predator. Eleanor felt the old instinct rise to shrink, to apologize, to accept the role society had assigned her. But then she felt the weight of the diamonds at her throat, remembered the Duke's words in the firelit library, and understood that she had already survived the worst thing society could do to her. She had been invisible. Scandal, at least, was proof of existence. Before she could respond, the Duke appeared. He did not defend her with words or righteous anger. Instead, in front of 300 witnesses and the Queen herself, he did something unprecedented. He knelt. The ballroom erupted into shocked silence. A Duke did not kneel, except before monarchs, certainly not before an untitled woman of modest means in the middle of a social gathering. Miss Eleanor Hartley. His voice carried across the breathless quiet, steady and sure. You have asked what you are worth. Let me show you. He produced a ring sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the chandelier light like captured sky. You are worth more than my title, more than my fortune, more than the approval of every soul in this room. You are worth the one thing I have never given anyone, my unguarded heart. Will you marry me? Not as a duke seeks a duchess, but as a man begs the only woman who has ever truly seen him. Time suspended itself. Eleanor looked down at this powerful man kneeling before her, offering everything he was beneath, everything he possessed. Her answer emerged as a whisper that somehow filled the vast space. Yes. The room exploded applause, gasps, Lady Genevieve's strangled cry of fury. But Eleanor heard only the Duke's sharp exhale of relief as he stood and kissed her hand with a reverence that felt like prayer. The Queen began to clap, and society had no choice but to follow.